Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the morning session of what is going to be the longest day. That was once used for the Normandy landings, but I feel a program that is beginning at 9 o'clock in the morning and will probably end at 11 at night in the Cinematheque in Jerusalem qualifies for being the longest day, at least for some of us. We're very glad to have with us the Dean of the Faculty of Humanities, Professor Gabriel Motzkin, who will say a few words of greetings, and then we will begin with our first session, Old and New Anti-Jewish Stereotypes in Western Europe. I think we can ignore the United States because the discussant who was going to give or provide a view from the United States has been taken ill. I don't know if that is a symptom of what is happening to Mr. Bush's America right now, but be that as it may, please welcome Professor Motzkin.
Thank you. I must say, it's particularly moving to me to be able to say a few words of greetings to you, and that's because of a biological connection. My grandfather was a Zionist leader called Leo Motzkin, who spent a major part of his life fighting anti-Semitism in Eastern and in Central Europe between 1919 and 1933, and published extensively on anti-Semitism in Poland, in the Ukraine, and in Germany. And in coming here to this morning, I was trying to reflect on what was the difference between the anti-Semitism that he confronted and the anti-Semitism that we now confront in our world. Anti-Semitism in his world was a universal phenomenon. To his office in Paris, Jews would stream from Romania or from Poland, and he would listen long to late in the night to all their little stories of some pogrom in some village, because that's all the help he could offer them, was to listen to their stories. And what characterized that anti-Semitism was its fundamental antinomianism. In all those places, the anti-Semites before 1933 were people who not only hated the Jews, but were trying to subvert the rule of law, because the laws of the lands in which they lived, the minorities treaties and other such laws, protected the Jewish populations, and anti-Semitism, in order to succeed, needed to subvert those laws. Now, I don't think that's our anti-Semitism today. I was trying to think of why this sudden recrudescence in our own world, why it is that the post-war hegemony in which we all had a romance with the other is beginning to fade, and that instead of others we begin to be that we like or that we want to be like, we begin once again to be suspicious of alternative identities and where our place is in that. Now, Herzl's solution to the Jewish problem was to make us normal. He argued that if we were to be normal and no longer abnormal, anti-Semitism would disappear. But the result is that we are now the normal other instead of the abnormal other, but we're still other. And so the result is that in our normality we have to be surrealized. I don't know how many of you, but I imagine most of you, like myself, spend some part of the day reading newspapers of the world on the internet. I read The Guardian and The Independent, and the result is always that we're quite normal, brutal oppressors, and we have to be surrealized in our normality. In other words, it's no longer that we are ghosts deeply conspiring, at least in the mild anti-Semitism that I perceive, but that our normality has not stripped from us that fundamental otherness. Think if the people of Israel, instead of the people of Israel, were the people of Greece or somewhere in this conflict, that we were not Jews. What would be the rhetorical divide? We would still be condemned for much of what is going on, but we would not be condemned, I believe, in quite the same rhetoric, because of this fundamental necessity of the culture in which we live to find demonic others, even if they are demonic others who are quite normal. I wish you an interesting day. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Motzkin. Our first speaker this morning is Gilad Margalit, who is a lecturer in modern German history in the Department of General History at the University of Haifa. He has a special research interest in the post-war process of coming to terms with the Nazi past in Germany, and with a subject that is becoming, I suspect, in fact, not I suspect, I know, more and more central in the German public consciousness today, namely this feeling that they themselves suffered greatly during the Second World War. In fact, Gilad, 2 days ago in a radio program, when I was asked about this question, I prophesied that there will be a great future for the Germans as victims of World War II. I suspect that this is an inevitable process, but one that will undoubtedly have implications for relations between Germany and Israel, Germany and its Jews, and no doubt that may be one of the themes that you'll be addressing. Gilad Margalit has also dealt with German treatment of ethnic minorities in general, with a particular interest in policies towards the gypsies, for which indeed he published an acta in the for the Vidal Sassoon Center. I'd like to mention his book, Germany and Its Gypsies, a post-Auschwitz ordeal, which appeared in 2002 in Hebrew and German editions. Gilad.
Thank you, Robert. Breaking the Taboo, Anti-Semitism and the German Media. During the summer of 2002, the taboo on anti-Semitism was broken in two different scandals that occurred almost simultaneously in Germany. The Möllermann scandal in the political arena and the Walser scandal on the cultural scene. This paper pertains mostly to the Möllermann scandal, in which the German media was used to disseminate a mixture of anti-Israeli contents imported from the Arab world, together with traditional anti-Semitic cliches. I would like to start with a survey of this scandal and an analysis of its most biting remarks. And then I will discuss the role of the German media in such scandals. Since April 2002, Jürgen Mellemann, the vice chairman of the Liberal Party, FDP, and the chairman of the German Arab Society, had been airing anti-Israeli and anti-Semitic remarks against the leaders of the German Jewish community, as well as against Israel and the Israeli Prime Minister, Ariel Sharon. In his remarks, Mellemann adopted the style and the contents of German political far-right groups. German commentators spoke at a time of idealization of the Liberal Party. After Auschwitz, anti-Semitism lost its former respectability. No German anti-Semite would like to be regarded today as such. Anti-Semites present the criticism on their biting remarks as attacks on the freedom of speech or on the freedom of art, as in the case of the Martin Walser, and their critics as taking advantage of the heightened sensitivity of Jewish topics in German political culture due to the Nazi past. Such anti-Semites argue that their critics aim at delegitimizing the justified criticism on specific Jews or the state of Israel and its policy toward the Palestinians. For this purpose, Möllermann had used an anti-Semitic Semite, one Jamal Carsley, a former local Green politician in North Rhine-Westphalia of Syrian origin. Carsley has taken on the role that was reserved in the past mainly for specific Jewish figures. I call them Paradejuden, who, as victims of Nazism, or at least as members of the victims' collective, enjoy in the German political culture a public status as if they were martyrs. This status enables them to do what the average German usually shies of doing, to break the taboos. Carsley unequivocally equated Zionism with Nazism. Such remarks would appear too blatant in Germany, even for Möllermann. Carsley remarks had supplied Möllermann with an anti-Semitic agenda imported from the Arab world, but whose idioms were of European origin and therefore well known to the German anti-Semites. On April 24, Carsley appeared at a press conference with his new patron, Jürgen Möllermann, and declared that he had been chosen to join the Liberal Party. Carsley decided to leave the Green Party due to his opposition to the pro-Israeli policy of the Green Foreign Minister Joschka Fischer. Following the battle in Jenin, Carsley accused the Israeli army of using Nazi methods against the Palestinians. Although at the press conference he begged to be excused for this comment, he continued to disseminate anti-Semitic remarks. 1 week later, Carsley gave a long interview to the extreme right-wing newspaper Junge Freiheit, during which he claimed, and I quote, "The influence of the Zionist lobby is very great. It controls the largest share of the world media and can bring down the most powerful. Think only of President Clinton and the Monica Lewinsky affair. People in Germany are understandably afraid of its strength." This interpretation of the Lewinsky affair, stated in 1998 by the Hamas leader in Gaza, Sheikh Ahmed Yassin. Yassin claimed that Lewinsky affair is a Zionist conspiracy aimed at blackmailing Clinton to stick to his pro-Israeli line. German far-right circles were very keen to adopt this interpretation. The mighty Jewish lobby is actually manipulating the most powerful man on earth and controls his most crucial political decision, as declaring war on Iraq, what became much more relevant today. From this point, Möllermann embarked on a media campaign in which he agreed with Carsley's remarks and put the blame for anti-Semitism in Germany on Ariel Sharon and Michel Friedman. Michel Friedman is the vice chairman of the Central Committee of the Jews in Germany, and he also runs a popular talk show. I am afraid, Möllermann said, that hardly anybody gives more fuel to the anti-Semites who regrettably exist in Germany and who we must fight against than Mr. Sharon and Friedman with his intolerant, spiteful manner arrogant. That is not okay. Friedman had claimed before that Israel has a right to defend itself against the Palestinian suicide terrorists. In the long run, Möllermann's ambitious attempt to use anti-Semitic campaign for attracting voters from the extreme rightist scene and thus to bring over to the FDP, to the Liberal Party in Germany, MS support, he called it Project 18, failed at the ballot. His party and his own career were severely damaged. His anti-Semitic remarks immediately triggered a very wide counter-campaign of protest in the media against Möllermann himself and his party, in which all prominent politicians, including the German Chancellor Gerhard Schröder and the former leadership of the Liberal Party, took part. Due to the public protest, Möllermann protégé Karsley was forced to resign the FDP. Former prominent liberals put pressure on the FDP chairman Guido Westerwelle to restrain the public remarks of his deputy. Möllermann had to apologize to the Jewish co-citizens for his remarks, but he did it half-heartedly and stubbornly refrained from apologizing Friedman. I am not going to grovel to Mr. Friedman, he said. If the Jewish Council, he meant the Zentralrat, keeps coming back with the demands, the public is going to say enough already. One should never slap an outstretched hand. 2 days before the election, last September, he had used dubious funds for publishing a flyer in which he repeated his attacks on Friedman and Sharon and portrayed himself as an impartial politician struggling for a just peace between Israelis and Palestinians. Möllermann was kicked out of the FDP only after the fiasco at the polls. They received only 7% instead of what he wished to arrive to 18%. And because of the secret fund scandal caused by his flyer, he was not resigned because of his anti-Semitism. The support he enjoyed from the party's apparatus recently prevented his removal from the North Rhine-Westphalian local parliament in Düsseldorf. In the never-ending struggle against anti-Semitism in Germany, this result might mark a Pyrrhic victory. Möllermann's venomous anti-Semitic remarks had circulated in the media for some months and had reached a wide public. It appears that the very echo that the anti-Semitic messages receive in the media grant it legitimization among those who had secretly identified with it but did not dare to say so in public. These are not so few anymore. Although the majority of Germans reject the most biting anti-Semitic remarks, still too many Germans agree with people like Möllermann. For example, according to the polls of the second German television, ZDF, 28% of the Germans justified Möllermann's accusation against Michel Friedman. This results correspond with the results of public polls conducted early in 2002 that 31% of the Germans in the old West Germany regard the Jewish influence as too large. 4 years ago, a similar poll indicated 14% only. Anti-Semitism, Israeli Israel and the German media. As a result of the Holocaust and of the Allies' re-education policy, a taboo on overt communication of anti-Semitic expressions emerged in Germany. It was partly a self-imposed censorship on public communication of anti-Semitism. Dealing with Jewish issues was so sensitive in the post-war Germany that it was first and foremost regarded as a political matter. Consequently, it was handled rather cautiously in the German media. All topics concerning the state of Israel were regarded as falling within Jewish themes, and hence they received as such treatment. Until 1968, most of the West German press generally treated in these topics with due respect, adopting a stance which was sympathetic to Israel and to Zionism. But this taboo had been always transgressed, in public as in the media, not solely by Nazis. Usually in such breaks on taboo, the German media became a platform for disseminating anti-Semitic contents. The earliest breaks of the taboo in the aftermath of the Shoah had already occurred during the direct Allies' occupation of Germany. Just to mention the Adolf Bleibtreu scandal of 1948, in which an anti-Semitic letter was published in the Süddeutsche Zeitung. Too often, criticism of Israel or of Israeli policy in German media has received a certain smack of anti-Semitism. I call to mind the renowned anti-Semitic depiction of Israeli Jewry in 47 and 48 in the articles of the late Marion Gräfin Dönhoff. She was one of the publishers of Die Zeit, where she equated Nazism with Zionism. Accusing the Jews of acting like Nazis became in Germany a repeated topic since then, as it exculpates generations of Germans of their feelings of guilt toward the Jews. Let me cite here the editor of Die Zeit, Josef Joffe. If the Jews act like Nazis, then the crimes of our forefathers are put into perspective and rendered historical, and the children of the victims can no longer point their fingers at us. Generational changes and the escalation of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict since 1967 gave a rise to pro-Palestinian positions within the media. Some journalists could hardly evade adding certain anti-Semitic insinuation or undertones to the reports and comments on Israel. This trend reached its peak during the Lebanon War of 1982 and during the First Intifada. The policy of most German media regarding anti-Semitism, especially toward its cultural manifestation, is usually lenient. The media enable anti-Semites to present their views freely, as if it were a respectable opinion, and even renders them certain alibi. The editor of Der Spiegel, for example, chose to balance a highly critical article on the Liberal Party by one of his reporters and a sharp attack on German anti-Semitism by the Jewish journalist Henrik Bachner during the scandal by publishing the well-known opinion of a Jewish Israeli commentator, Yuri Avneri, under the outrageous caption, we want no special treatment. In German, keine Sonderbehandlung. Sonderbehandlung means murder in the Nazi jargon of the final solution. Avneri claimed that Israel brands as anti-Semitic every justified criticism on its policy. The extreme rightist newspaper Junge Freiheit was always very keen to interview Avneri. In this interview, Avneri did not shy from defining the German Jewish organization, the Zentralrat, as a branch of the Israeli embassy, Filiale. By doing so, and with his sharp attacks on the German Jewish establishment, Avneri substantiates in fact that the claims of Möllermann and Carsley and arms the most ardent critics in Germany of this insolent attempt to break the taboo on anti-Semitism in the German political culture. Even Jamal Khashoggi, a Syrian immigrant in Germany, has used or has become aware of the public importance in the German political culture of using Paradejuden as a legitimization for anti-Semitic slander. In his website, Carsley claimed his positions are supported by a Jewish Holocaust survivor of Auschwitz, a certain Hayo Meyer, as well as certain Israeli of the radical left scene as Ilan Pappé, Lea Zemel, and Michael Warshawski. While most commentators during the recent scandal sharply criticized Möllermann and the Liberal Party for their strategies, Claudia Roth, the head of the Green Party, even summoned him for instigation and defamation. The newspaper Die Welt initiated a meeting of reconciliation between the members of the Central Committee of the Jews in Germany and prominent leaders of the FDP. Möllermann did not appear at this meeting. This initiative calls to mind the attempt to reconcile the late chairman of the Central Committee, Ignaz Bubis, and the author Martin Walser after the former scandal, Walser scandal in 1998. It was backed then by the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung. It seems that the leading German newspapers are much keener to reconcile the Jews with the anti-Semites than to take an unequivocal stance against them. Although Möllermann's blatant anti-Semitic provocations were rejected by the majority of the Germans, this populist politician was not forced to resign, as had Philipp Jenninger at the time. It seems that anti-Semitic protest did not succeed in delegitimizing the use of It seems that the anti-Semitic protest did not succeed in delegitimizing the use of anti-Semitic cliches in the cultural and artistic world. Even some of Walser's critics find it extremely hard to define his book or him as anti-Semitic. According to the cultural editor of Süddeutsche Zeitung, Joachim Kaiser, who supported Walser, anti-Semitism represents an absolutely malevolent attitude and not merely a nuance. His example of typical anti-Semitic publication is obviously Hitler's Mein Kampf. Of course, using Hitler as a measure for anti-Semitism makes every other manifestation of anti-Semitism appear less virulent, even harmless and innocent. Last July, the German satirical magazine Titanic reacted most appropriately to this sickening situation with an apparently absurd issue with cover ask, and I quote it in German, schrecklicher Verdacht. War Adolf Hitler Antisemit? In English, terrible suspicion. Was Adolf Hitler an anti-Semite? And thank you very much.
Thank you, Gilad. One always has to start worrying when Germans start to break taboos, it seems, and we already had an experience here in December with an earlier conference on anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. And now it's my pleasure to introduce the next speaker, Henrik Bachner, who's a member of the Department of the History of Ideas and Science at Lund University in Sweden. His recent publications include an obviously very pertinent work for our deliberations, which I will not attempt to pronounce in Swedish, although I have it in front of me, but translation to English would mean Resurgence, Anti-Semitism in Sweden after 1945. He's worked extensively on the subject of anti-Jewish motifs in the public debate in Sweden, and he will talk about the public debate today, but also looking back, so I understand, as I did in my opening talk yesterday, to the Lebanon War in 1982. Thank you.
Thank you. With the exception of certain forms of Islamic Jew hatred, anti-Semitism in today's Europe is basically the same phenomena as yesterday. A historically and culturally rooted, transmitted set of beliefs and attitudes towards Jews. But new elements that nourishes, activates, and sometimes modifies these beliefs and attitudes continuously enters the scene, and new contexts emerged in which they come to expression. Post-Holocaust or contemporary anti-Semitism in Europe, the German historian Wolfgang Benz has written, to a large extent, and I quote, feeds on feelings of guilt and shame, expresses itself as a denial or a trivialization of the Holocausts, and masks itself as criticism of Zionism and hostility toward Israel, end of quote. The upsurge of anti-Jewish hostility in Europe during the last years seemed to confirm Bendt's characterization. But it also underlines the need for a better understanding of how anti-Semitism is related to perceptions and attitudes toward Israel and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and to problems related to the Holocaust. This paper will discuss these topics from a Swedish perspective, drawing on the findings of a broad study of the public debate in mainstream media during the Lebanon War in 1982, and of a similar but more limited examination of the debate on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict during the last 2 years. I shall try to outline and discuss the characteristics of anti-Semitism as a factor in the Swedish debate on Israel. My main focus will be on the anti-Jewish motifs that emerge. As I suspect that the history of Swedish anti-Semitism is fairly unknown to many, let me just point out that this history dates back to the Middle Ages, and in terms of ideas does not differ much from the Christian anti-Jewish tradition prevalent in many other European countries. Recent studies have shown that traditional religious and secular anti-Jewish stereotypes remained an integrated and fairly well accepted part of Swedish culture until World War II. Negative perceptions of Jews also influenced popular attitudes as well as restrictive government policies toward Jewish refugees from Nazi Germany in the 1930s. As in many countries, the impact of the Holocaust led to a strong delegitimization of anti-Semitism in the dominant political culture of post-war Sweden. But long-held and deep-rooted prejudices did not totally disappear. An undoubtedly limited yet significant revival of anti-Jewish thinking could be discerned at the end of the 60s and the beginning of the 70s within the context of extreme left-wing anti-Zionism. Yet, with time and with the emergence of a more critical stance towards Israel amongst broader segments of the public, similar tendencies could be observed within parts of mainstream political opinion. The effects of these developments could be seen in reactions to Israel's Lebanon war, which unleashed marked anti-Jewish reactions in many countries, including Sweden. Before turning to the anti-Jewish motifs that emerge in the Swedish debate, it is important, though, to stress that most of the discussion, which in the main was sharply critical of Israel, cannot be judged as anti-Semitic. Nevertheless, a substantial number of articles, editorials, news reports, readers' letters, political cartoons, and so forth, did contain anti-Jewish elements. An analysis of the Swedish debates elucidates both the persistence and flexibility of anti-Jewish thinking. It shows how stereotypes and beliefs, largely absent from the public discourse for decades, can easily be revived and adapted to new circumstances. Although Sweden is one of the most secularized countries in Europe, the anti-Israel mood created by the Lebanon War unleashed a flood of age-old Christian anti-Jewish perceptions, which were then woven into and rationalized as criticism of Israeli government policy. In general, it can be said that the original theological construct of Judaism as the antithesis of Christianity, the construction of the contrast between Christian love and forgiveness and Jewish unforgivingness and malevolence, constituted a leitmotif in the anti-Semitically tinged argumentation during the war. A recurring theme was that of a specific Jewish vengefulness and cruelty, often referred to as an eye for an eye mentality, an Old Testament wrath and bloodthirstiness that was said to characterize Israeli behavior. The following comment by a columnist in a mainstream paper illustrates the discourse. Quote, Israel is building its ideology on the Old Testament. We doubt that there can be peace before this unyielding grip has loosened. How different the New Testament is with its extirpations of differences between Jews and others. End of quote. These traditional perceptions were also often integrated into a Holocaust or guilt-related discourse. An editorial in the leading social democratic daily, Aftonbladet, explained the motives underlying the Israeli invasion in the following way, quote, Israel is taking a terrible revenge these days. Revenge in accordance with the harshest words on the Old Testament. Revenge for the horrible suffering that befell the Jewish people in Europe. End of quote. A few days later, the same editorial writer claimed that the Palestinians were now being, quote, exterminated by Israel, and this reminded him of, and I quote again, the persecution of the Jews in Europe. End of quote. Another common theme was the using of the concept the chosen people when criticizing the Israeli invasion. The notion of chosenness was interpreted as signifying Jewish racism and Nazism, as well as Jewish striving for power and domination. And it was frequently suggested as an underlying explanation for Israel's invasion of Lebanon and for the often brutal consequences of Israeli warfare for civilians. In the Social Democratic daily Arbetet, a well-known writer offered the following comment, quote, there is a genocide going on in Lebanon, the black-winged shadow of a swastika being cast over Beirut. Children are being murdered because the Jewish people were persecuted for hundreds of years by the Christians of Europe. Human beings are of no import, only chosen peoples matter. End of quote. A columnist in another social democratic daily, Arbetarbladet, wrote, the Old Testament, still the holy scripture to the Orthodox Jews, gives advice to Israel on how to treat the enemy. It is recommended that a city which has been conquered should be destroyed. Anything alive should be killed. The enemies of the Jews must be exterminated. These are second-rate people for whom Jehovah has no compassion. End of quote. The Swedish debate also included other traditional anti-Semitic beliefs. Among them was the myth of Jewish control of world finance, politics and the media, and the conspiratorial fantasies that often accompany such ideas. But these ideas were primarily to be seen in the far-left anti-Zionist argumentation, even though they also did leave traces within the political mainstream. A third prominent theme was the analogy between Israel and Nazi Germany and between the Israeli invasion and the Holocaust. The debate spurred by the war showed that this motif was no longer, as it had been since the end of the 60s, the preserve of anti-Zionist propaganda, but had gained legitimacy within a significant part of public opinion. There are probably several reasons for this change of climate. However, the problem of coming to terms with the mass murder of the European Jews and its historical, political and psychological consequences seems to have been the major factor behind the increased popularity and usage of such images. No doubt, concepts such as Nazism and the Holocaust have become symbols of evil in the post-war world and as such are being used and misused for various reasons. But there is a fundamental difference between the application of these images to Jews and the Jewish state and the use of Nazism and the Holocaust as metaphors when discussing other topics. Much points to that this kind of fantasy in a European and definitely in a Swedish context is best understood as a form of liberation demonology, the transformation of victim into executioner, the Jew into Nazi, has not only brought relief, but has also given vent to an aggressiveness and frustration which the issue of guilt and the muscling of expression seem to have generated. Also, constructed as a Nazi, the Jew again becomes a legitimate target. This interpretation would appear to be plausible if we look at the argumentation which in many cases supported these representations. The recurring references to guilt, to irritation over not being able to speak in an ambiguous terms about Israel, and generalizing assertion about the transformation of the Jews. Moreover, it is given credence by the scope, intensity, and above all, selectivity in the pattern of association. An examination of a number of Swedish newspapers shows that other conflicts and atrocities in the world that took place during the same period as the Lebanon War never aroused analogies or images of Nazism and the Holocaust. But the readiness to accept the image of Israel or Jews as Nazis and perpetrators of a new Holocaust must also be explained with reference to all the pre-existing patterns of anti-Jewish thinking, primarily the construction of Jews as symbols of evil. In Sweden, the fantasy of the Lebanon War as a new Holocaust quickly became epidemic, appearing in hundreds of editorials, news reports, readers' letters, and so forth. Although Israel was the center of attention, the concepts Israel and the Jews were often used synonymously in this discourse. Israel was compelled to repeat the crimes committed against the Jews in Europe, thus revealing the true character of the Jews or what they had become. Israel then, in this context, functioned as the collective Jew, both a symbol and an object of projection. This becomes abundantly clear when looking at the way the central message was often conveyed, and I quote, "The victims of inhuman treatment in the 1930s have become the Nazis of our time." Another example reads, "The former victims of the Nazi racist extermination policy have switched roles and have instead become executioners." A third example, "The children that 37 years ago were victims of annihilation, today without any hesitation used the same means against new children." End of quote. Having constructed Israel as a Nazi state committing a Holocaust in Lebanon, conclusions were then constantly drawn about the former victims and the Jews as a collectivity. Moving over to present time, and the anti-Semitic upsurge that has been noted in Europe since the outbreak of the Second Intifada in 2000, it is safe to say that Sweden has not been unaffected by this development, but more research is needed before we can adequately assess its impact. An examination of news coverage and the public debate on Israel within parts of mainstream media during this period, however, allows us to draw some preliminary conclusions about how anti-Jewish prejudice is coloring some of the discussion. Again, though, I would like to stress that from this more limited examination it cannot be said that criticism against Israel in any general sense is tainted by anti-Semitism. Some of the criticism is, but it is not the dominant pattern. Yet it is also important to stress that parts of the general criticism directed against Israel seems to be influenced by irrational motives that might be, but must not be, anti-Semitic. What I'm referring to is primarily the many times extreme indignation that Israeli policies unleash amongst part of the public opinion, a reaction seldom to be found with regards to other countries or parties involved in a conflict, with the United States as the possible exception. But if these outbursts are not accompanied by specific linguistic expressions, the underlying motives are of course difficult to determine and analyze. However, if we keep our focus to the media and to the identifiable anti-Jewish motifs, a basic conclusion is that they are very similar to the ones surfacing in 1982. Also, this time around, Christian anti-Jewish images, particularly the idea of an Old Testament vengefulness, are frequently woven into descriptions of or criticism against Israeli policies and actions. According to the liberal daily Expressen, for example, Israel, in its response to Palestinian violence, was, and I quote, implementing the primitive teaching of an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, end of quote. An analysis also echoed by the correspondent of Sweden's National Broadcasting Corporation, who explained that Israel's acts of war was an expression of, and I quote again, the Old Testament command of an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. During Easter 2002, Aftonbladet, intentionally or not, revived the accusation of Christ killing when it, on its editorial page, condemned Israel's policy towards the Palestinian under the heading, The Crucifixion of Arafat. A second theme that has re-emerged, and much more strongly so than in 1982, is the myth of Jewish power and manipulation of politics and media. These ideas seem today to be much more attractive and also much more tolerated within mainstream political opinion. And this can be seen not only in the frequent fantasy-like descriptions of the omnipotence of the so-called Jewish lobby in the United States, a lobby that in the minds of some Swedish observers single-handedly runs American foreign policy. The entering of these ideas into the mainstream can also be observed in other contexts. A frequently repeated charge is that Israel is protected from criticism, that truths about Israel are tabooized and censored. According to this mythology, politicians and media in Sweden and other Western countries are either controlled by Jewish or Zionist interests, or so afraid of these, quote, powerful forces or lobby groups, these two are the dominant code words for Jewish power in the Swedish discourse, so afraid that they don't dare to speak their mind. A typical example of this kind of reasoning can be found in the writings of Herman Lindqvist, one of Sweden's most well-known journalists and an author of best-selling popular history books. In an article in Aftonbladet in late 2000, Lindqvist claimed that most Swedish journalists visiting Israel are, quote, shocked by the Israeli arrogance and racism towards the Arabs, end of quote. This, however, is never reported to the Swedish public, he continued, the reason being that few dared to write about this, knowing that those who did, quote, immediately become sprayed with poison by powerful and influential pro-Israeli lobby groups, end of quote. Another example can be found in a program produced and broadcasted by Swedish Public Service TV, Swedish television. The program, specializing in examining the media, claimed last year that the full truth about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was never revealed in the Swedish press. And the reason for this, it was explained, was that 3 out of 6 Swedish correspondents in the Middle East were Jews, and that pressure from the Jewish lobby and the Israeli embassy made Swedish newspapers censor certain information that might be negative for Israel. The idea of Jewish power and manipulation also frequently colors the debate on anti-Semitism as a contemporary problem. What I am referring to here is not the justified criticism which is directed towards those voices which tend to brand also quite legitimate criticism against certain Israeli policies as anti-Jewish. What I have in mind is instead what might be described as a new and growing mythology that totally denies or grossly trivializes the problem of anti-Semitism, and that claims that anti-Semitism today more or less is an invention by sinister Zionist lobbies with the purpose of silencing criticism against Israel. These kind of claims and insinuations, which indirectly are based on the idea of Jewish control and manipulation of public opinion, are very common in the Swedish mainstream media. Also, when attention has been drawn to clear-cut and vulgar forms of Jew hatred, like Radio Islam, for instance. Another indication of the tolerance and the new attraction to the fantasies of Jewish omnipotence and conspiracies was the broadcast of a satirical program called The Third Power in Swedish Public Service Television in August 2002. In a feature that it was argued that it is not always bad being a victim. The point was illustrated by the Holocaust. Images of murdered Jews in Nazi concentration camps, of stocks of gold barrels, and of jubilant Israelis were accompanied by a text explaining that the Holocaust wasn't so bad for the Jews after all, since it gave them a state and billions of dollars from Germany and Swiss banks. As a consequence, it was argued, the position of the Jews was now stronger than ever. The feature ended with an image of the World Trade Center and an insinuation that there might be a connection between Jewish power and the events of September 11th. An unambiguous use of the myth of Jewish control of Western and Swedish media is also to be found in some of the websites belonging to certain groups within the Swedish anti-globalization movement. The third theme discussed in connection with the Lebanon War, the projection of Nazism and the Holocaust onto Israel or Jews, is also present in the current debate. Within the radical left, it constitutes a central element in the anti-Israeli propaganda. And again, it is quite clear that these demonic fantasies have little to do with the Middle East conflict, but a lot to do with the European past. In a recent issue of Ordfront magazine, maybe the most influential left-wing periodical in Sweden, a well-known journalist and best-selling author, Katarina Massetti, commented the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as follows, and I quote, "Maybe it is time to stop the efforts of taking Swedish youngsters to Auschwitz in order to teach them the consequences of racism and ethnic cleansing. Maybe we should invite them for a Christmas trip to Bethlehem instead, so that they can have a look at what the grandchildren of the victims of Auschwitz are up to when they are devoting themselves to ethnic cleansing." End of quote. What overall conclusions can then be drawn? To begin with, the analysis of the Swedish public debate on Israel demonstrates that there is an intimate relationship between anti-Semitism and perceptions, attitudes, and reactions to Israel and the Middle East conflict. And it shows that the debate on Israel is a major forum for anti-Semitism within mainstream political culture. This is so primarily because Israeli policies and actions and the criticism they draw serves as a stimulus for pre-existing anti-Jewish sentiments and prejudice to become manifest. But the debate on Israel also becomes an important forum for anti-Jewish prejudice because it constitutes the only public arena where negative attitudes toward Jews can be legitimately articulated, since in this context they can easily be packaged and rationalized as criticism of Israel or Zionism. Furthermore, the examination demonstrates the persistence of traditional Christian and secular myths and stereotypes in post-war Swedish anti-Semitism. But it also points to the adaptability and flexibility of anti-Semitism as well as the propensity for its renewal. It shows that the consequences of the Holocaust play a crucial role in shaping the features of post-war anti-Jewish thinking, and it indicates that the projection of Nazism and the Holocaust onto the Jewish state or onto Jews in general constitutes a central element in the contemporary anti-Jewish discourse. Finally, the examination also indicates that with a rising anti-Israeli mood, there also seems to be a greater tolerance toward anti-Jewish expressions within the mainstream media. The level of acceptance with regard to anti-Semitism then seems to rise and fall with the fluctuation of public opinion on Israel. Thank you.
Thank you, Henrik, for that sobering but I think very important case study of a country which we are all familiar with as having been in the past one of the more friendly countries towards Israel, and it's a very striking transformation that has taken place. It's with particular pleasure that I introduce the next speaker, who is Margaret Brearley, whom I've known over the past decade, actually for the first time when we made the film The Longest Hatred, in which she appeared in a cameo performance on Richard Wagner, which is one of the subjects that she has written about extensively. Margaret is the advisor on the Holocaust to the Archbishops' Council of England and a lecturer at the London Jewish Cultural Centre. Previously, she was a lecturer and fellow at Birmingham University, Selly Oak Colleges, and at the Institute of Jewish Affairs, what was previously called the Institute of Jewish Affairs in London. She's been very active in Zionist and Jewish causes and has directed in the past the West Midlands Israel Information Committee and chaired the West Midlands Friends of Israel Association. In her academic work, she has written about Zionism, anti-Semitism, Christian-Jewish relations, and also about the history of the persecution of the Gypsies. And currently she chairs the National Council of British Beatso and is British Vice President of Faith and Freedom, the International Christian-Jewish Association on the Middle East. She's going to talk about Israel in the Intifada in the British secular and religious press, which I think she's eminently qualified to do. And recently when I was in Britain, I noted that alongside the fact that Britain is the staunchest ally right now of America with regard to Iraq, there really is a tremendous wave building up from below, not only of opposition to the war in Iraq, which led to this huge demonstration in London that some people say was as many as 2 million people, but also, again, a mounting wave of anti-Israel feeling, which slides over into anti-Semitism. And only a few days ago, I was sent a fax with an article from the London Evening Standard by A.N. Wilson, a very well-known writer, who possibly Margaret may mention or may not mention. Israel's record speaks for itself. This is a mass circulation paper, and among the points that A.N. Wilson made is to claim, again, to go over the history, Israel's record, dispossession of the Palestinians, refusing the right of return of 800,000 Palestinians, claiming quite falsely that it has used weapons of mass destruction, complaining about the overseas aid it feels, and generally saying that the creation of the State of Israel was a mistake. It's wonderful to see you here in Jerusalem, Margaret, and thank you for coming.
Our eldest son Joshua died suddenly in his sleep 8 weeks ago, so I apologize if my paper is less profound than that of some other contributors. I've been plunged into a different kind of profundity in the last 8 weeks. Apologies for that. We sent Joshua to a Jewish kindergarten and primary school. He came back in the early weeks saying, "There's a new joke. All of the airplanes in the world fly like this. The airplanes of El Al fly like this." In 2001, there were claims that the British media is biased in favor of Israel. The social commentator Polly Toynbee, calling for a boycott of Israel, argued that media coverage of death is race-biased, evoking sympathy only for Israeli victims and annexing our emotions. In April 2002, at the time of Jenin, Middle East correspondent Robert Fisk argued that, astonishingly, Israel is winning the propaganda war. New Statesman at the same time attacked the Zionist lobby. In May, Glasgow University Media Watch argued that the BBC coverage was favouring Israel. Yet the reality was very different. In the same month, the Israeli press attaché accused the British press of portraying Israelis as satanic demons. Ample evidence exists that anti-Zionism in the British media, as in intellectual life generally, has intensified in the past 2 years, and especially in the past 12 months, indeed as anti-American feeling has grown. Newspaper proprietor Conrad Black argued that, quote, most relevant sections of the BBC and the Independent, Guardian and Evening Standard newspapers are rabidly anti-Israel. In 2002, 125 academics signed a letter in The Guardian calling for a moratorium on all national and European grants and contracts to Israel. A report highlighted many examples of anti-Israel bias in the BBC, while last autumn both BBC, ITV and Carlton Television ran strongly anti-Zionist documentaries. Israel's very right to exist is now questioned, among others by A.N. Wilson, who last week viciously attacked Israel using anti-Zionist material, which it's now known was actually written by a Holocaust denier, and the Evening Standard has now apologized. But he's not retracted what he said. Among intellectuals and most of the quality press, anti-Zionism is now ubiquitous. And what I am saying is simply the tip of the iceberg. Anything that I say could be exemplified from hundreds of articles. Israel and its leader are uniquely demonized, especially, but not only, in the left-of-center quality press. No other state, however brutal or corrupt, no other leader, however genocidal, is similarly demonized. Journalists commonly equate Sharon and Arafat, for example, as 2 old men, 2 weak men, yet they are not treated equally. Sharon is typically described as intransigent, bullying, overweening, an inflexible hardliner thriving on fear. His past is constantly evoked to brand him as war criminal. Arafat, however, is described in mild, endearing terms. Perky, heroic freedom fighter, ever flexible, deeply ambiguous. peace seeker, though iron-fisted when necessary, at very worst, a buffoon. Reports during the Ramallah siege verged on hagiography, portraying Arafat as ascetic, teetotal non-smoker, arch-victim suffering a different kind of pain, longing for martyrdom, and defined, according to one headline, as defended only by boys with slingshots. Arafat's past is ignored, or if mentioned, stereotyped as heroic survival. While reports during the recent election highlighted Sharon's links to corruption, Arafat is dissociated from corruption. Hanan Ashrawi wrote a long Guardian article on corruption in the Palestinian Authority without once mentioning Arafat, although condemning Sharon's war crimes. Trevor Mostyn, in the Catholic Tablet, described Arafat as surrounded by corruption, although not himself corrupt. Such bifocal vision focuses sharply on Israel's perceived crimes while blurring Palestinian actions. Similarly, Israeli violence is seen through a microscope. Israel commonly sends in death squads to kill Palestinians in killing fields, a term recalling deliberately the Cambodian genocide. Its killings are executions or assassinations. Israeli soldiers are harsh, killing protesters in cold blood, routinely treating Palestinians with brutality and cruelty and using torture. Israel uniquely uses psychoterror against its enemies. Sharon, according to the New Statesman, even killed Hamas militant Humud in order to provoke suicide bombings. Palestinian violence is seen not through a microscope, but through a telescope. Particularly since September the 11th, Palestinians are never terrorists. Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade are described only as militants, guerrillas, activists, or paramilitaries. Their weapons are, according to Jonathan Friedland, puny, the meager weapon, the meager tools of resistance of a powerless people. Torture and the killings of suspected collaborators, in the hundreds, are almost never mentioned. There is rarely any sense of outrage against their killings of Israeli civilians. Such killings are generally in retaliation for Israeli oppression, and therefore less culpable. Occasionally, bombings and shootings of Israeli citizens are even implicitly admired as being, quote, spectacular or, quote, meticulously planned. Various techniques are used to delegitimize the state of Israel. Parallels are commonly drawn from Israel to Iraq and to apartheid South Africa. Israel's government, generally typified as hardline, was described recently in the New Statesman as crypto-fascist and in The Guardian as a colonial occupier. Robert Fisk, writing in The Independent, wrote, "The reality is that the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is the last colonial war." Many journalists argue that Barak's peace plan would have created a Palestinian state of Bantustans, very commonly used word, and that Sharon has created one vast prison. Israeli settlers are likened to American colonial settlers committing genocide of Native American Indians. Clifford Longley in the Tablet and other journalists too. Brian Sewell claimed in the Evening Standard that the Palestinians under the Israelis have suffered far worse and far longer than Jews under Hitler. Headlines referring to Israeli military action frequently use loaded words such as vengeance and revenge. Some articles use stock words such as malevolent and dark forces, drawn from the standard arsenal of anti-Semitism, while Zionism is still referred to frequently as racist. It is striking that many of these current techniques for blackening the Jewish state are parallel to those used in Soviet anti-Zionist propaganda of the 1970s. Soviet ideologues then devalued Israel's uniqueness by likening it precisely to colonial South Africa and the Palestinians to oppressed Native American Indians. Soviet ideologues too associated Israel with cruelty, monstrous crimes, terror, and famously equated Zionism with racism. They too argued that Israel instigates terror in order to trigger counterattacks. One technique effectively used by Soviet propaganda of the 1970s was criticism of Israel by disaffected Jews, including Yuri Avneri. In the past 2 years, such criticism has been ubiquitous in the left-wing British press. Writers such as Yuri Avneri, Yoav Peled and Amos Oz are drawn largely from the peace movement. They, like Bernard Wasserstein and others, write forcefully against Israeli policies and actions. This in itself is utterly valid. But the choice of Israeli interviewees is more questionable. Interviews with disaffected soldiers who refuse to serve in the occupied territories are not matched by any parallel interviews with soldiers convinced of Israel's cause. Long interviews with parents or relatives of Israeli bomb victims are almost always with those such as Yitzhak Frankenthal, whose grief has led them to excusing Palestinian violence as, I quote Frankenthal, crazy acts of despair. As an occupation force, it is we Israelis who trample on human dignity, crush the liberty of Palestinians. Virtually all voices that speak are thus against Israel. Long extracts in the Times of Laura Blumenfeld's book Revenge, for example, included without comment letters from her father's Palestinian communist attacker, which were unadulterated propaganda against, quote, a Zionist ideology which is racist in its basis and fascist in its aims and means. While Palestinian poverty is stressed, increasing destitution in Israel is scarcely mentioned. A Guardian editorial last month, unusually giving statistics of Israeli poverty, used them to mock Sharon's economic mismanagement and his, quote, begging bowl to Washington. There is little empathy for Israelis. A New Statesman article in 2002 dismissed Israel's large Russian population simply as, quote, white Soviet trash. In the Evening Standard, Brian Sewell contrasted the ancient race of Palestinians with the, quote, vociferous and greedy immigrants from Moscow and New York influencing Israelis. There are many interviews with non-Jewish human shields, refugee workers, and others overseas supporters of Palestinians, but none with comparable supporters of Israel. Indeed, overseas supporters of Israel are maligned. Norman Lebrecht recently mocked a London pro-Israel rally of some 50,000 Jews as a cheap family day out, as, quote, worthless or worse. American pro-Israel Christians were dismissed by Robert Fisk in The Independent as fundamentalist. There is a darker side to the alliance, he wrote, while Reverend Colin Chapman in the Church Times attacked them as extreme, millenarian and dangerous. Many journalists employ syntactical devices to appear neutral while actually attacking Israel alone. Words and phrases such as even if, but, whereas, and however are skillfully manipulated to give a cursory mention of Palestinian violence or corruption, followed by far longer and much more detailed denunciation of Israeli wrongs. Thus, apparent objectivity can mask a passionately one-sided bias. Soviet propaganda utilized subjectivity, engaging emotions solely on behalf of Israel's perceived victims. Current British left-of-centre journalism uses many techniques to create empathy primarily or exclusively with Palestinians. Photographs of pretty, pregnant or weeping Palestinian women abound. Those of Israeli women are rare, generally plain, and often used to make a political point against Israel. Language describing Israeli victims of terror is generally objective, as remote as the long-distance photographs of their nameless bodies. Indeed, the reader is often immediately alienated by descriptions of Israeli crowds calling for vengeance or stabbing the assailants. Yet, Palestinian suffering tends to be in near focus, named and vivid. Palestinian children are not killed, but blown apart by Israeli soldiers. Eyewitness accounts of anguish are closely observed and heartbreaking. Photographs, interviews, graphic descriptions invite readers to identify with Palestinians as uniquely suffering victims, indeed perhaps the only truly human victims. More surprisingly, while active antipathy is often evoked towards Israeli settlers, who are dehumanized as arrogant, extreme right-wing, fanatical, active sympathy is often evoked now for Palestinian suicide bombers. Unquestioned descriptions by family and friends give them almost iconic status. Typical is the first suicide bomber, Nabil Aria, quoted in The Guardian by friends as a gentle, deeply religious young man, and Izzedine al-Masri, who, according to the headline, sacrificed himself, killing 15 Israelis in the Sparrow pizzeria. The kindest, the gentlest, his sister said. Journalist Sarah Helm, visiting Izzedine's family, stressed idyllic olive picking and cascading bougainvillea. Such sympathetic linkage between Palestinian violence and natural beauty is common. Her visit to the Sparrow pizzeria, on the other hand, underlined a contrasting commonplace, that of ugly Israel, a commonly used phrase now, typified by the red-skirted waitress squirting Thousand Island dressing into plastic pots. In their treatment of the Intifada, journalists prefer subjective empathy rather than objective analysis. Ideology is almost never discussed. While Zionism is simplistically condemned as colonial or racist, the ideology of Arafat, Hamas and Hezbollah is ignored. Arafat's Muslim Brotherhood roots may occasionally be mentioned, but never with reference to Sayyid Qutb's pivotal ideology or to the ideology of Muslim Brotherhood. Suicide bombing is almost universally attributed to the bomber's personal experience of Israeli cruelty or to more general despair. A Guardian article on child shaheeds this month admitted that Israeli claims of indoctrination had some truth, but immediately focused instead and at length on Israel's terror, which had turned refugee camps into virtual prison camps. The British religious press largely shares this antagonism to Israel. That is understandable. The Archbishop's envoy to the Middle East, Canon Andrew White, recently pointed out that Christian attitudes to the Middle East are now deeply intertwined with Palestinian liberation theology. Palestinian and other church leaders engage with the Western media on behalf of Palestinian suffering. British church leaders actively engage in Middle East peacemaking, brokering the 2002 Alexandria Declaration. Christian journals consistently prefer the name Holy Land to Israel, and although the Jewish state is given no theological status, Christian values and even God are invoked to demonstrate its unholiness. In a Church Times article headlined "Israel the Unjust Stewards," a particular reference to Christians, Archbishop Desmond Tutu began, "God is weeping over what he sees in the Middle East, but he weeps only for the Palestinians due to attacked Palestinian humiliation, Israel's horrific attacks and inhumanity, the powerful Jewish lobby, and even the possibility that Israel might, quote, exterminate the Palestinians." Religious eyewitness articles give powerful first-hand accounts of Palestinian suffering, while Jewish suffering is mediated very second-hand in the tablet and scarcely at all in the Protestant press. Christian Palestinian suffering and their massive diminution in numbers from 20% down to now 2% of Palestinians in the occupied territory are attributed exclusively to Israeli oppression and never to its other cause, oppression by Islamic radicals. At Christmas and Easter, articles against Israel proliferate, contrasting the Christian message of peace, hope and goodwill with its absence in Israel. This year, Holocaust Memorial Day was marked by a Church Times article arguing that, quote, "In Ramallah, in reality, was the suffering and deprivation that I could only imagine in Auschwitz." The clergyman-writer reinforced his Ramallah-Auschwitz comparison by claiming that in Israel the Holocaust is used as a means by which anything is justified. Valid criticism of Israel is never anti-Semitic, but is anti-Zionism anti-Semitic? Not necessarily so. One can, to be sure, discern elements of traditional anti-Judaism in the current religious and secular press. The Guardian has described Israel as unrepentant and obdurate. Old canar, such as an eye for an eye, the unforgivingness of Jews, and their vengeful male god are regularly recycled. There is far less outrage at Palestinian violence on the Jewish Sabbath and Passover than there is over claimed Israeli desecration of Christian holy places. Indeed, in 2002, two violently anti-Zionist television documentaries in Britain were timed specifically to coincide with the Jewish New Year and Yom Kippur. Several recent cartoons have linked the Israeli Star of David to unequivocal evil. But such clear anti-Semitism is rare. And there are writers, such as the Catholic Clifford Longley, and journals such as The Tablet, well known for their philo-Semitism, and yet ultra-critical of Israel. However, if anti-Semitism is the singling out of Jews for unique demonization of almost mythological proportions, then much current anti-Israel rhetoric is indeed anti-Semitic. Israel is, in a sense, the international scapegoat. Israel is a convenient lightning conductor, diverting the world's attention from far greater atrocities and real genocides committed by Muslims, Christians, and other non-Jews. Rage against Israel allows individuals and communities to feel and express against Jews the moral outrage, even hatred, which they suppress over evils far closer to home or far more distant and invisible. Yet some of today's anti-Zionism is not simply anti-Semitic. It is, albeit unwittingly, part of asymmetric warfare, by which terrorist organizations aim to delegitimize and overthrow nation-states. The means of asymmetric warfare are many, ruthless, and genocidal. They include mass killings of civilians using conventional weapons and, when available, weapons of mass destruction and possibly cyber-terrorism. The demoralization of the enemy population to the extent that its civilians will seek surrender at all costs and its soldiers will no longer have the will to fight. Above all, the delegitimizing and eventual overthrow of the nation-state by black arts propaganda and innovative manipulation of the media. Jenin, April 2002. Jenin should have been a media success for Israel because of its attempt to save Palestinian civilian lives. To lose as many as 45 soldiers fighting in close urban warfare and to kill only 57, mostly fighting men, is, I think, unprecedented in recent Western wars. In its recent Afghanistan war, the USA has lost far fewer soldiers and has killed several thousand civilians. But Jenin was a media disaster for Israel and a brilliant success for asymmetric warfare. Jenin was repeatedly and over a long period described by much of the British press as ethnic cleansing, a monstrous Israeli war crime, massacre, indeed genocide. The timing, too, was brilliant, coinciding with the ratification of the United Nations International Criminal Court, established precisely to prosecute ethnic cleansing, war crimes, and genocide. Israel as a criminal state, an illegitimate state to be dismantled, that is one aim of radical asymmetric Islamist warfare, an aim which some sections of the British press now unwittingly foster. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that powerful exposition. I often feel I wish there were more Anglo-Jews who were as clear in their perception of what is happening as Margaret Brearley is. And she takes a very courageous stand in the current situation. Our last speaker this morning is Simcha Epstein, Dr. Simcha Epstein, who's a senior researcher at the Vidal Sassoon Center and has been associated with it for a number of years. And he, as you will discover when he begins to speak, is French in origin, in fact born in Paris, and received his PhD from the Political Science Department at the Sorbonne. I'd like to mention in particular his most recent book, Les Dreyfusards sous l'occupation, which was published in Paris in 2000 and was awarded a prize by the Académie Française. And he has worked over many years on the notion of waves or cycles of anti-Semitism. He's an expert on waves, and he'll talk about them once more here today. So without any further ado, I pass it on to you, Simcha.
In 1936, a French mainstream magazine, news magazine, which previously was pro-Jewish and pro-Zionist, became anti-Semitic. It turned to anti-Semitism by a very famous article in December 36. It was a part of the growing anti-Semitic waves in Europe and in the world in the 30s, and it manifested by the turning from non-anti-Semitic papers to anti-Semitism. This was the famous Gringoire, which became anti-Semitic in December 36. Of course, the Jews responded by various ways. The most interesting response of the Jews was the creation of a new paper, which was called Grégoire. Grégoire is a player on words, of course, but it is more than a play of words. Grégoire was referring to the Father Grégoire, who at the end of the 18th century helped the Jews to attain emancipation during the French Revolution. And so the Jews concentrated in fighting the anti-Semitic Gringoire by creating the Grégoire. This is an illustration, this is more than a play on words. This is an illustration of one of the strategies of Jews in general fighting anti-Semitism in the press or in mediatic channels by creating alternative channels, alternative mediatic channels, in order to fight channels becoming anti-Semitic or propagating anti-Semitism. I will start by a historical presentation, and I will say a few words about strategies of confronting anti-Semitism in the media during the last 2 years. At the end of the 19th century, before the Dreyfus Affair and during the Dreyfus Affair, the Jewish community reacted against anti-Semitism, which was propagated by the press, firstly by trying to fight it by the law. It was impossible in France because France was a country of freedom of speech. Freedom of speech does not allow the Jews to fight defamation by law. It was easier to do that at the same period in Germany, and that is an explanation of the difference of the reaction of French Jews and German Jews at the end of the 19th century. It was easier to do that in Germany. It was very difficult to do that in France because of the extension of freedom of speech. So the possibility of stopping anti-Jewish propaganda by law or by judicial means was not given to the Jews. And so the Jews tried another strategy, which was the effectively practiced strategy at the end of the 19th century, which was to create or to finance alternative channels of mediatic channels, which means at the period alternative newspapers. And we know now that there was a secret Jewish organization, well-financed, which bought and financed papers. It may be existing papers, newspapers, which became pro-Dreyfus suddenly because they received a Jewish subsidy. It may be new papers that were created especially by the Jews. Two very important papers of the period, one which was called Les droits de l'homme, the right of man, and was financed by the Jews. And L'Humanité, which was a socialist and then the communist newspaper in France, was also financed by the Jews. I say that based on Jewish sources, of course. And this brings us to a dilemma, a dramatic dilemma of historiography. Saying what I said is something horrible and unacceptable, because it means that the Jews secretly finance, organize themselves, and secretly finance the press, or part of the press. That was precisely what the anti-Semites say at the period, and what they say till today. The anti-Semites at the period said that the Jews had organized a syndicate that was financing, secretly financing the press. And what did the Jews say at the period? They said, of course not. It's a lie. Of course not. What will say the historians and the Jewish historiography coming afterwards? They will say, of course not. And they will come to the conclusion, Hannah Arendt and Marus and others, that the Jews didn't do anything. They didn't react to the wave of anti-Semitism at the end of the 19th century. And we know now, by Jewish sources, that there was a Jewish underground activity of financing the press. And Philippe Auriol, who is finishing now a research for our center, will show that completely and with a lot of new documentation and a lot of new sources, that it was true. This is one of the dilemma of Jewish historiography. We have to say that because it was a defense, it was a self-defense activity, it was the choice of a strategy, of an underground strategy, which was the only strategy possible for a little minority confronted with a wave of hostility. And so that was the strategy they decided to there was another reason for choosing such a strategy of secret financing of the press. It was that one of the themes of the Jewish defense at the period, at the end of the 19th century, was that anti-Semitism is a threat for everyone and not only for the Jews, which has remained a main theme of Jewish defense alongside all along the 20th century. And so if you say that anti-Semitism is a threat for everyone and not only for the Jews have to make themselves very discreet and very secret in all the organization. And the press has to present itself as a general press or a general reaction, French Republican reaction to anti-Semitism. We find the same structures and the same patterns of reactions during the 30s. The 30s are the second wave of anti-Semitism, of modern anti-Semitism. It starts in French in 32, 34, 36, 38. It's a growing wave of anti-Semitism in the 30s, and we find exactly the same problem. First, there is no law permitting fighting anti-Semitism by court, and a part of the Jewish energy and of the Jewish activity is to obtain such a legislation. To obtain such legislation, it will be done in 1939. The first anti-racist law in France will be accepted in April 1939. Of course, it will be abrogated in 1940 and re-established after the war. And the second activity, which is financing papers, will manifest itself also during the 30s. And we have a lot of variations in that kind of activity. You have specific Jewish papers financed by Jews and fighting anti-Semitism, Racism, which fights racism on an intellectual and scientific basis. You have La Juste Parole, which is dedicated to the Christian sectors of the population, which are also a dedication to specific sectors of activity. And you have also a pressure exerted on the big newspapers of the period. Radio, radio in the 30s is for the Jews, for different reasons. You have a lot of conferences against racism in the radio, which exists in the 30s. In other words, the strategy that was developed by the Jews in the 30s was creation of alternative channels or exerting influence or pressure on existing channels of communication. Of course, like in the end of the 19th century, when they were asked, do you finance the press? They answered, no, of course not. The anti-Semites say we are financing the press. The truth is we are not. That's what the Jews said, and it was legitimate to say we are not financing. The historical truth is that they were financing the press. Not to such an extent that the anti-Semite claim, of course, because the anti-Semite presented the Jews as something terrible and financing everything, which was not true, of course. But basically the strategy was used by the Jews in the 30s. What happens now? And I looked at the reactions of the Jews of France in the last 2 years, which may be compared to their reactions before the Second World War in the 30s, at the end of the 19th century, which may be also compared to their reaction during the former waves after 1945. For instance, the wave of the end of the 70s and the beginning of the 80s, which was a strong, real strong anti-Semitic wave, or the end of the 80s and the beginning of the 90s, which was also a very important wave. There are some differences. I would like to mention a few differences between the reaction of today and the reaction to the former wave. First, there is a reaction. There always has been a reaction, and there is today a reaction. The Jews are not different now than they were beforehand. The Jews react to anti-Semitism. On the contrary of what a certain Jewish historiography will claim, and I have no time to speak about the distortion, the Jewish historiographic distortion of the attitude of the Jews, of the reaction of the Jews to anti-Semitism. Secondly, during the last crisis, the crisis of the 2 last years, there was more unanimity among the Jews about the seriousness of the situation. There was more unanimity than 10 years ago during the former crisis, or 20 years ago during the crisis of the end of the 70s or the beginning of the 80s. Now we find more unanimity. Of course, you have always fringe elements which are against the general consensus of the Jews and of the Jewish community, but basically you have more acceptance of the fact of the seriousness of the situation. You don't have acceptance of the fact that we are speaking of waves, and you don't have also the remembrance, the exact remembrance of the former waves by a very, very interesting intellectual phenomena which erases the former waves from the collective memory of the Jews. We are dealing with the wave of today, but we are forgetting what happened 10 years ago or 20 years ago. There are different reasons to that deleting of the immediate memory. And the main reason, of course, is that the Holocaust projecting its shadow on everything between the Holocaust and today, and so we forgot what happened in the 70s, we forgot what happened in the 80s. A few words about the sociology of Jewish reactions during the last 2 years. It is a pluralistic reaction based on a multiplicity of channels of reaction. That was one of the things which struck me. You have a lot of initiatives by little groups or by little societies fighting by their means the general trend. For instance, the Jacques Tarner's initiative to make a film about it, Clément Veil-Reynal, which we had invited in December, in last December, organizing a group of Jewish journalists in order to be able to react immediately to what is published in the press. The reaction during the last 2 years is much more pluralistic, and it is not centralized. the main reason of this multiplicity of reaction and not of the centralization may be found in the fact that the media itself is much more pluralistic and decentralized than it was 20 years ago or 30 years ago, or certainly that it was at other periods. The multiplicity of channels of attacks, which means the multiplicity of channels of mediatic channels, explains the multiplicity of channels of reaction. Multiplicity and decentralization, which is one of the characteristics of the present-day Jewish reactions. But this should be my conclusion. What struck me in the reaction of the Jews to the last wave, or the French Jews to the last wave, it's not only true for the French Jews, it's much more general. They reacted, there was a reaction, as there was a reaction. They choose the same theme of reaction that was the theme of reaction at the end of the 19th century, in the 30s, and beforehand. They don't remember that it is an old theme of reaction. They think it is a new and intelligent theme of reaction, but it is a strict repetition of the theme of reaction. The theme was burning a synagogue is threatening the Republic. Those who burn the synagogue are threatening the Republic, which is a classical Jewish French reaction and Jewish European reaction to anti-Semitism, saying that anti-Semitism is a threat for everyone and not only for the Jews, hoping by saying that the others will gather and will come with us to fighting anti-Semitism. This hope was expressed at the end of the 19th century, and we said exactly the same thing. Attacking the Jews is attacking the Republic. We say that, of course, in the 30s, and we say that today. In order to be able to say that today, and that will be my last remark. My last remark for the moment, I mean. Saying exactly the same thing means that something has been erased from our collective memory. Something has been deliberately erased by a collective movement, by a collective move, from our collective memory, which means that we used that slogan. We used it for 100 years with the efficiency that we all know and we all understand, because anti-Semitism continues his work with its ups, with its downs, with its waves, with its growing intensity, because what we saw after 1945 is that the waves of anti-Semitism are of growing intensity, and we still go with the same theme and the same slogans that the threat for the Jews is a threat for everyone, and we think it will be efficient, and it is not. It's good to say that, of course, on a rhetorical basis, but it doesn't mean that it will be efficient. Anti-Semitism is part of Jewish history, and it will remain a part of Jewish history.
Well, we've heard 4 illuminating papers on Germany, Sweden, Great Britain, and France. The floor is now going to be open. We have about 20 minutes time for discussion. What I'd ask you to, we'll probably take these questions in waves as well. What I'd ask you, if you have a specific question to a specific speaker, say so. We'll take about 3 or 4 in the first wave. Yeah. If you can use the mic, it might help.
My question is directed to Dr. Margalit and Dr. Epstein. Dr. Margalit, how much emphasis do you place upon the Bitburg incident of 1985 with Reagan, Kohl, etc., in the visit, as far as breaking the taboo, which you refer to as the premise of your paper? And Dr. Epstein, what I would like to know, in terms of turning towards the diplomatic process, we're all aware of the term of the shitty little state. How much of this was emblematic, if I may use the term, of the Quai d'Orsay?
Let me address this first to you, Dr. Epstein. when you speak of ways, do you find the anti-French feeling that is engendered here, well, not here, in the United States, has had an effect on public policy, one, and also about the universal rights of man, the fact that Jews do not fit into the special universality of what should be the rights of man. Has that been dealt with educationally in any way? And I'd like to ask Dr. Case, as far as England is concerned, do you feel that much of the anti-Semitism is put on, as you say, to the universal figure of Jew and Israel because there is inherently a great deal of anti-Muslim feeling in England, which I've encountered going there. They may hate Jews, but they certainly do not like the Muslim population. And also, as far as the terrorism is concerned, has that had any effect on the feelings of being aware of what is going on?
My question is to Henrik Bachner. To what extent, can you hear me? To what extent is the largely appreciated initiative of the Swedish Prime Minister Persson of giving the Swedish people a better understanding of the implications of the Holocaust by his project Living History, has it had, let's say, a counter influence, an influence that in another direction of the picture that you have described to us of the Swedish media? And just a remark about what you said about that there was a claim that the Swedish covering of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict by Swedish journalists in Israel is very biased for Israel, in favor of Israel, because there are 3 Jews out. So I just want to mention what you of course know, but the public here might not know, that one of the 3 Jews writing for one of the biggest papers in Sweden, Svenska Dagbladet, is known as having the most extreme critical views of the policies of the Israeli governments, all Israeli governments, not only the last one. So it seems that facts don't have any influence when you make your claims.
About the Quai d'Orsay, yes, and the Silicon State, yes, you are right. It was quite an emblematic. It was both emblematic and extreme. It was, both emblematic and extreme. Yes. About what you said about anti-French feelings in the United States, in order to
does it have any effect on the way the leadership and the population, the average Frenchman feels, considering Israel and the United States?
Both at the end of the 19th century, there was a threat of American boycott of France during the Dreyfus affair. There were a lot in the 70s also. There were such a threat. And now, on the last period, there was also such a threat. It has its importance in France, it is true. But it may be used also. It had its importance, yes. It has a certain importance on the French, but not in the direction of fearing from the threat, but on the direction of combining, anti-Americanism and anti-Semitism as the same reaction. Yeah.
Yes. To your first question, then the Swedish Prime Minister initiated a conference on the Holocaust in the year of 2000, and after that also a project of Holocaust education, and which has had a lot of attention in Sweden. And has it affected the situation, the attitudes? It's very difficult to say. Then, at the time, it was a much appreciated effort also in Swedish. In Sweden, within the media, it had a broad political support. But this also had to do with the fact that there was a different situation in Israel, in the Middle East. This was before the Second Intifada. And what is very clear is that also attitudes towards remembering and learning and studying the Holocaust is connected to attitudes towards Israel. Because when this Intifada started and the criticism against Israel started to increase, the discussion about the Holocaust sort of died out, and it was taken up as an argument against the Swedish Prime Minister, who's been accused of being too pro-Israeli by large part of the center of left public opinion. But what is also clear is that the Holocaust conference in Sweden also irritated quite a lot of people within the academic world, among intellectuals, but also among the part of opinion who is critical of Israel. There were even, I could mention, Sten Andersson, the former Swedish foreign minister, accused Göran Persson, who is in the same party, the Social Democratic Party, of being of listening too much to the wishes of the Jewish lobby in organizing the conference on the Holocaust. So this is a very complex matter, but it's definitely connected to the attitudes towards the Middle East. Now, regarding the three reporters accused in this Swedish television program, correspondents in Israel, the one you are mentioning, who is very critical of many Israeli policies, is certainly one of those three reporters. But what is interesting in this program, saying that Swedes don't get the truth about Israel, this was one of the factors, one of the explanations was that three reporters were Jews, but it was nothing they had reported, said, or written. It was their Jewishness that made them suspect.
Is Britain inherently anti-Muslim, and is that affecting the portrayal of the Intifada? There may well be anti-Muslim feeling within sections of the population, but that is very rarely articulated in the quality press. There is a great fear of being Islamophobic, and so Islamophobia is absolutely not respectable and is not tolerated in the press. And on the contrary, there are other traditions, particularly within the Foreign Office, of a strong pro-Islamic tendency, and also in more popular culture, of the noble Saladin and the ideal of the Islamic hero and the Islamic Golden Age. And these are motifs which have been particularly stressed in the last 2 years, and have been many articles by Christians, by Muslims, and secular writers arguing strongly that Al-Qaeda and others are absolutely not representative of normative Islam, and stressing that Islam is a peace-loving religion. And so I would say that by and large there have been many attempts to counteract any anti-Muslim feeling within the population over the last 2 years. In terms of terrorism, I think that in Britain there has not been the same kind of shift in perception that there has in America. You may know Rohan Gunaratne, the leading expert in Britain on Al-Qaeda, argued in a book published last year that there was an attack planned to be made on the Houses of Parliament on September the 11th, that an Al-Qaeda team went to Heathrow to hijack a plane to fly it onto the Houses of Parliament, but that it was foiled because all planes were grounded immediately, that the Twin Towers were attacked. And I assume that Gunaratne's account must be true. Had that happened, there would have been a similar shift in perception, of course, in Britain to the one that there has been in America. But by and large, the anti-American feeling has grown, I would say, in the last year quite substantially and noticeably in Britain. And so there has not been a kind of a powerful new awareness of the dangers of terrorism in Britain.
I'd like to address my question to. I would like to address my question to Professor Epstein. I happen to be a scholar, but I'm also a witness, and I'm a Frenchman involved as an actor in the type of strategies you have described. And as an actor, I'm using the tool, and it's not only a tool, the argument, because I believe in it, of republicanism. You described this argument as a slogan, and as a slogan that failed. And I think that I'm extremely shocked by the use of the word slogan, and I'm extremely dubious about the nature of what you call failure. I think that the question is how successful is a counteraction and how long does it last? And if it lasts a few months or a few years or a few decades, can't you consider it a success? Now, as to the nature of the slogan, I would like to know, how do you address a political culture if you don't use the vocabulary of that very political culture? How can you be persuasive? How can you build an argument? I think that it is perhaps a tool that has proved to be less efficient than it might be, but it's one of our only tools, and I would like to see what you propose as an alternative.
The question is for all of you. Being myself many times angry at Israeli policies and all the time angry at European media for the way they cover it, my question is, how can a European journalist today criticize Israeli government policies without being accused of being an anti-Semite?
Yes, a question for Margaret Brearley. To what extent has there been any show of bias on the part of church leaders? I'm talking about the very top sections, not just in articles in church press, but in pronouncements, in sermons, official bulletins, etc.
I'd just like to add one question to Margaret from a quotation that I'm sure you're familiar with. After the disaster of the Columbia space shuttle, Abu Hamza, the imam of the Finsbury Park Mosque, said the following, and this was reported on the 8th of February this year. He said, first of all, that of course it was God who had destroyed the space shuttle, but then he added, it's a trinity of evil because it carried Americans, an Israeli, and a Hindu, a trinity of evil against Islam. And I noticed in the Old Bailey trial of Abdullah el-Faisal, which is going on right now, that the jury were instructed to be not to hold, that the judge decided there should be no Hindus and Jews in the jury. And I just wonder, apropos the Islamophobia question, how you see this effect of the Islamic element that is inciting in this way, and how the British public is responding right now to this. And I think we forgot Gilad the first time round. So
never mind.
One more question, and then we'll let Gilad go first.
My question is directed to the panel as a whole. To what extent is the anti-Semitism that we're discussing here confined to a particular element of the population in your various countries, and to what extent is it a phenomenon of the population as a whole? Is it confined, or do we find the entire population involved in this kind of an anti-Semitism?
Okay, I would like to refer to your question about the Bitbook gesture of 85 and the current anti-Semitic scandals. I think a distinction should be made between the Bitbook case and what has happened in the last year, because at the Bitbook gesture, it was an initiative by the German Chancellor Helmut Kohl to make a reconciliation gesture between the two nations on the military cemetery in Bitburg where members of the SS are buried. This particular gesture pertains to the peculiar German memory of the war and the peculiar German mourning culture which developed in the Federal Republic of Germany. For the Jewish public opinion and the Western public opinion, it was, or by the Jewish and Western public opinion, it was regarded as a scandal because it transgress the way Jews are thinking of the German soldiers. But for the official German mourning culture in the Federal Republic of Germany, it was not regarded as taboo or as breaking a taboo, but it was totally complied with the German tradition which developed since the Cold War in West Germany. And nowadays it's something totally different. Nowadays it's a clear attack on taboos which exist in the media on such themes, Jewish themes, and Israelis falling within this frame of Jewish topics. And nowadays it was also considered as breaking the taboo in German terms, and not only in the international terms. Bitburg was not maybe it has some anti-Semitic elements, but mainly it was a scandal regarding to the German history and the way the German history is conceived by Germans vis-à-vis the rest of the world. Here it's a pure anti-Semitic scandal, and there were, and I think in my paper I had referred to the protest that it elicited among the German political culture and not only abroad.
I will refer to Daniel Dayan's objection. I do something more revolutionary. I'm going to speak. To make it more dramatic, it's a classical debate, a classical Jewish debate. It happened in Germany in the beginning, in 1930. It was a very important debate between those who said the rise of anti-Semitism es geht Deutschland, which means it's a problem of Germany, as the Zentralverein said, or the Ziffer Zeitung said, and between those who said, as the Jüdische Rundschau, the Zionist paper, said, es geht die Juden. I mean, it's about the Jews. It's not about Germany, it's about the Jews. It's a classical debate. The debate occurred also at the end of the 19th century. Because when the French Jews choose the same ideological line, let us say it's not a slogan, it's more than a slogan, it's a strategic and ideological line, saying that anti-Semitism is a threat for everyone and not only for me. Ahad Ha'am, who was one of the leaders of the first generation of the Zionists, published a very harsh and terrible article which was called Avdut betoch cherut, which means liberty in slavery in liberty. And he said, look at these French Jews, he said. They are saying anti-Semitism is against everyone. And he asked, is it not enough to beat a Jew for the beating to be important? You have to say that they are beating also the democracy and the French and the non-Jews? Is it not enough to say that we are beaten as Jews? Is it not enough? And it was an attack against the French Jews of the period. It was specifically directed against the French Jews. Of course, he meant not only the French Jews. He meant emancipatory Jewry, of course, because the argument was not specifically French. It was a classical argument in emancipatory Jewry, saying we are part of the nation. Attacking the Jews means attacking the nation as a totality and not only attacking the Jews. So the argument remains till today, and I recognize the legitimacy of your positions. The only thing I would like to ask you is to recognize the legitimacy of my position. Which means, when I say that I don't believe in that, it's not true, it's historically not true. It also brings to solutions which are not the same solutions of the Jewish question, of course, because following your line, we go to an integrative solution of the Jewish question, a diasporic integrative solution to the Jewish question. Following the other line, we go to a Zionist solution of the. So that makes it a real ideological debate. So let us conclude that we have to respect both of the positions.
Bias on the part of church leaders in Britain, on the part of senior leaders, archbishops, no. They try to be as unbiased as they possibly can in their public pronouncements, while clearly calling for sympathy for the plight of Palestinian Christians. It's safe to say that virtually all bishops are against the war in Iraq. All church leaders are, with almost no exceptions. And there would be many who would consider the Israel-Palestine issue to be as important as that of Iraq, possibly even more important. Among individual bishops, there's no doubt that there are a few who are very openly anti-Zionist and strongly pro-Palestinian, but they have much greater liberty to be so. In terms of the the Muslim population and incitement, the FBI has estimated that by the year 2000, 80% of all mosques in the USA had been radicalized, taken over by Islamic radicals. There's, I think, no knowledge of to what extent that would apply in Britain. It is assumed that some mosques are highly radicalized, but it isn't known how many would be. But there is increasing Muslim influence in the debate on Israel-Palestine. The Muslim Alliance joined together with the Socialist Workers' Party and the CND in helping to create the massive demonstration last Saturday, which may have had up to 2 million people. And it was noted that there were no placards saying Free Iraq, but many placards bearing the slogan Free Palestine, which is perhaps an indication of increasing influence in that direction. And certainly the Arab press does incite the Muslim population. The Arab press in London is deeply anti-Semitic, containing many anti-Semitic cartoons and statements, and quite commonly equating Sharon and Hitler. But as far as I'm aware, would be very little influence of that onto secular journalists.
Okay, I'd like to thank all the speakers in the audience because... Oh, sorry.
No, I just wanted to make a comment. There was a question here whether what segments within the population where we find anti-Semitism. And I just want to say, with regards to Sweden, it's very difficult to say because we have no sociological studies of that kind. But what is quite clear is that when we look at on the Ovid level, where we can on written material and so forth, it exists within, as I have explained, within center of left opinion, especially within the left wing political opinion, anti-Jewish attitudes are more common than in other parts of, should we say, the broader political culture. But of course they are strong within the extreme right. On the other hand, the extreme right is rather small and not a legitimate voice within public opinion. But what can be said, the only investigation that I know of that has been done, which also was led forward to the conference on the Holocaust in the end, was a study of attitudes among the student population in Sweden, among the younger population, which showed that among those who expressed doubt of whether the Holocaust had ever existed, the group of immigrants were a bit overrepresented in this material, and it's difficult to analyze exactly, but it probably indicates that among the new immigrants, of whom many are immigrants from Muslim countries, such ideas are more prevalent.
Excuse me, just for adding, that was very pronounced at Concordia University in Montreal, exactly that, the immigrant control of the student union.
Thank you. I think we've all deserved a coffee break, and we'll be returning in about a quarter of an hour for Eastern Europe. And more punishment.